back with another episode of the Branders Magazine, Talking with Branders podcast. I'm your host, Steven Bacons, and I'm sitting here, well, not really, but he's across the pond with Jamie Ryder, a copywriter with a really unique background, but not so unique, with philosophy and stoicism. And that's something that is actually really has impacted my life as a brander, as a person, as just an individual. So I'm so excited to be sitting down with you, Jamie. Jamie, how are you? 60 seconds or less. Tell our audience a little bit about you.
Great. Well, thanks for the intro, Steve. I am based in Manchester, and as you very aptly put it, I'm a copywriter who brings philosophy into the work I do, particularly with mental health brands, self-development, and leadership companies that want to share their philosophy ethically through the written word, whether it is on the website, whether it is through the brand, the values, and making sure everything comes together so that message is correct, it's right, and it actually hits the targets that they're trying to reach as well, but also to share their story at the same time, because philosophy is that main goal that I want to share with the world for people. And it's just such a fascinating subject, as we've spoken about many times before.
Yeah. I call myself like a frustrated stoic, right? Like it's like almost like golfing. You're never going to be a great golfer, but every once in a while you might get a hole in one, right? But it's the practice, it's the everyday exercise. And I was turned on to stoicism, more than a decade ago after my life almost fell apart within 6 months, within a 6-month time period. And I found Marcus Aurelius and his meditations. And from that day forward, it has been this journey that I'm on, and a journey that I failed so many times and found a few successes. Jamie, for those that are not familiar perhaps with stoicism and with maybe just that area of philosophy, just illuminate and enlighten everyone on real brief, like, what is stoicism? Yes,
I love this question, because I think it's important to determine between what little s stoicism and big S stoicism.
Yeah.
I was certainly in the little s category before I knew what the philosophy was, which is, particularly for British people as well, we like to say keep a stiff upper lip. And it is that idea of being robotic, emotionless, just gritting your teeth and getting on with it. And I had certainly been guilty of that in the past, but over the pandemic, I really needed to recalibrate a lot of things. And that is when I discovered big S stoicism, which is the complete opposite. It is learning how to regulate your emotions, but in a very practical way, to be able to adapt, have some resilience there, but also to actually try to uplift your communities. And it all ties back to those key principles of justice, wisdom, temperance, and courage. And to me, that was such a illuminating experience once I learned about the story founded by a guy called Anthenium, who was quite a successful merchant back in the day, but he had to face his own journey of adaptability, where he was going to Athens and then boom, everything changed overnight. He was shipwrecked, didn't know what the hell he was doing. As the story goes, he stumbled into a bookstore just trying to find something to grab onto. He found a book by the philosopher Xenophon, who was a student of Socrates. And I think as the story went, he looked up at the bookseller and said, whatever is in this book is just super interesting. Where can I find people who can actually teach me this? And as luck would have it, the bookseller pointed out a philosopher by the name of Crates, who was walking by the bookstore, who was a Cynic philosopher, which is where Stoicism derived from originally. Now, Zeno learned from Crates over a number of years, and then once he was ready, he went out back to the Athenian marketplace to a place called the Stoa, which is where the name Stoicism comes from. It is the painted porch, where it was an open space where people could debate their ideas openly. And that is what I really love about Stoicism. It is being able to openly debate your ideas in a very logical, argument-driven way if you want to, but it is ultimately about tying back to this idea of living in accordance with nature.
Yeah.
And again, so much to pick apart there. And
yeah.
I thought it was that idea of, running through the trees naked, but I'm glad it wasn't that thing. Nature,
right.
Human nature, nature around you. So there's a lot to unpack there.
There's so much to unpack here, and keeping this, from the eyes of brand, philosophy, stoicism, capital S stoicism, and we could talk about the branding problem that stoicism has in a bit, lowercase versus capital, but capital S stoicism, the focus is on acceptance and tranquility. But in a world where, let's face it, brands are capitalizing, Jamie, on the emotions of customers, how do you approach stoicism when working with your clients and writing copy for them? Because you don't want to capitalize on the emotion. Like, you don't want to take advantage of the emotions of your customers, but that's what you're doing as a marketer, is you're capitalizing on the emotions. So how are you dealing with that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting paradox, that. And I always look at like the inauthenticity versus authenticity in that branding argument. I can only talk about my subjective experience, but for example, I really like working in the mental health space. And I think mental health messaging and philosophy has a lot of nice crossovers. And to me, obviously, sometimes mental health is done as a tick box exercise, but where philosophy helps me certainly is to actually dig deep into the questions of actually the research phase, because to actually get good copy, the research is so crucial. And if somebody is trying to actually get a very specific mental health message out there, then you need to do a lot of internal work with the values of the business first to make sure they're all aligned and they're actually trying to practice what they preach in-house before they can actually have any external messaging as well. And that's where I see that Stoic exercise thing coming in for me, because I can actually do these philosophical exercises with myself to try to determine the right questions to ask, and actually pause, ask about this opinion, but then also bring in a bit of skepticism at the same time, which I really take from a philosopher called Montaigne, which was actually very inspiring for that research part of what I do. But that's just a bit of the reason why I think you're going to get something far more authentic when you've got that authenticity from the people who believe in that message. And then if I believe in it too, then you can just feel it in the words. I think it's that unquantifiable thing, I think, but people read, they resonate, and it's the rhythm, it's the words, it's everything that comes together.
Yeah. Mental health, right? We're in a mental health crisis. And I'm sure the UK is the same as it is here in the States. What do you, when you're brands that you just see out there that are just checking that box, how does that make you feel?
Well, it annoys me, if I'm being completely honest.
Yeah.
Because it's like, it's just such a big topic, and there's this big trend at the moment, about well-being washing, and that really grinds my gears, because having been through my own fair share of very subjective mental health things in the past, it's like, I just want to be able to help people and actually help brands who actually want to make a difference. But you just see a lot of brands that are just trying to tick a box, or even if it's from like a workplace well-being perspective, to say that you want to bring in something to help people, but you are just doing it to actually look at it from a purely marketing-based perspective. And to me, there is nothing ethical there. But I can tell you a mental health brand that I really resonate with in the UK. It's called the Neuromuscular Centre, and it is the only place in the UK that actually caters towards people with muscular dystrophy. And the reason that resonates with me so much is because my father has that condition, and they've helped him a lot just by that. But even for people who just have different versions of the condition, if you look at their website copy, they have very long pages about, we can only say this, but we've got specialists who can actually help you do this. We're vetted by these partners. We do this and this. And I think that is how you actually get across that authentic message with brands like that. You're actually saying, here are the specialists who are actually vetted here. We've actually gone through everything. So I think you need to explain that in the copy as much as possible, to say, we aren't trying to pull the wool over your eyes. We want to help these people, and we've got the credentials to back it up at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. And what would you say for like a consumer facing brand, like maybe not a nonprofit where they are, doing good, but like even consumer brands are getting on the mental health trend. I hate to call it a trend or a fad maybe, but like when you see brands out there that are just checking that box, that are, again, that are, maybe it's a CPG brand, right? Maybe it's a footwear or whatever. What does that stir up? What kind of emotions does that stir up for you?
It's quite complex because again, there's nuance there for me because for all I know, people in that organization might be wanting to do good themselves, but they don't really have that educational background either. So my perspective on that is you want to bring in people who are equipped to deal with that. I mean, I was talking to a guy a couple of weeks ago who's big on bringing philosophy into workplaces anyway, but what he told me was a really good idea about having something like a chief philosophy officer in an
That's interesting.
or just have somebody who's purely dealing with mental health in a very specialist fashion, who has that background and can advise people, particularly from a branding perspective, because that is that internal work being done day to day. And then somebody can actually fact check that to actually say, this is the message we're putting out and this is why it is the right thing to do.
Corporate social responsibility is like a big thing, right? Like brands making sure that they do good. But the chief philosophy officer, I've never heard that term. Was that the first time you've heard that term?
Yeah, it was. And that was like, oh, wow, that's so fascinating. And you could bring in like a lot of different facets around what that role would actually have. But I just love that idea of philosophy being that thing that binds everything together. If it would be something like HR, if there was a bit of branding in there or something. So,
right. Yeah. Right. Yeah, I mean, I think we instantly start to think about employee branding. You start to think about workplace culture. You start to think about all these other facets where, having someone making, we used to call it the brand police back in the day, right? Making sure that you're sticking to those core values of the brand, you're living up to the mission, but it becomes bigger than just the brand police. You don't want to police people. You want to encourage them to do the right thing. I want to go back to, we were talking earlier about the customer. And so there's a fine line between, again, enticing the customer through persuasive language, right? And not stirring up their desires unnecessarily. How do you balance that? Like that's such a, like, especially you, like, it's almost like you are a little bit like the psychic in the way to where you know how to really play with people's emotion, but you want to do it in a way that is ethical. But again, you want to produce results for your clients. So like, how does that work?
Yeah. So again, it is that paradox, but if I'm looking at it from like a direct response copywriting perspective, you do have those, psychological techniques that come out with the research, because I like to work with ethical brands like Mental Health and Food and Drink. So just for me, from a personal level, if I know that they're trying to do good, then that makes me invested in actually what I'm writing about as well. So that's how I feel about that. But you are right with actually trying to steer the customer in a certain way. I think it is down to a language thing, because what I've noticed about mental health copy myself is you can't make any claims about this could help you or this is what you should use. It is about like, maybe try this, or there's this thing here that could work for you, but make an informed decision. So that is the element that the copy I would probably write about, is it's giving them like that in like an email campaign, for example, to say, here's something that you should try, but I want you to make an informed decision rather than just like the quick sell. So that is one way to look at it.
But just so much different than a lot of other copywriters out there, that sometimes copywriters are, I'm going to say it, the used car salesman of the marketing world, right? Because you know how to stir the emotions, you know how to write that really persuasive copy and to leverage psychological tricks, I guess you can call it, right? Whether it's scarcity, urgency, right? The art of FOMO, fear of missing out, and so we've had a lot of conversations, Jamie and I, and so it's always been fascinating to me that like the way you approach copywriting from this philosophical lens. And I've read some of your content, and your website has amazing resources on there. And so, how did you? So, where did your career come from? How did you become a copywriter? And at what point did your copywriting philosophy, no pun intended, shift because of philosophy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as a kid, I loved writing, but it was always from a creative writing background. I was like one of those romantic creatives who were like, somehow I'm going to make money as a writer someday. But yeah, I'm committed now. So loved writing stories. I did a creative writing degree at university. Then I did a master's in creative writing as well. And then copywriting came when I was like, right, I've got all this stuff now, so what do I do next? So I went into the agency world just to start learning about all this stuff. Worked in a few different industries, like bouncing around agencies for a while. But looking back after that, after about 5 to 10 years in that period, I just felt very burnt out by the end of it, because I'd seen like different sides where there's industries that were not being very ethical, shall I say. And when the pandemic hit, that was just like that idea where we had nothing but time. And I had never studied philosophy academically. I was certainly aware of it, but that was the time where Stoicism came to me through reading books, just listening to podcasts, and really reframing how I thought about a lot of things. And then I've realized mental health and food and drink and self-development were always industries that I'd been really interested in, but I'd never actually tried to do anything with them. But then that connection with philosophy made so much sense to me, and then it galvanized me to bring that practical philosophy out into the world and actually do all the work to research these people, understand their message, and then create it, because that is the philosophy that I love. It's the practical aspect of doing the thing day in, day in, doing the work, rather than just sitting back in an armchair, just like navel gazing and not actually doing anything, if that makes sense.
Navel gazing. I haven't heard that one before. You have a blog out there that is dedicated to drinking, to alcohol brands. Stoicism is very much about moderation. How do you balance writing copy for alcohol brands that are not necessarily, moderation isn't in their business plan. They want you to buy alcohol often. So how are you grappling with that? Because it's two ends of the spectrum when it comes to the philosophy.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I wear a slightly different hat in that, because I take that more internal for myself, because philosophy for me is like, it helps me fact check the brands that I actually like to work with. It makes me want to research them a bit more. But on that note of moderation, I like to bring in Epicureanism into that perspective, because I'm really interested in no and low, because that is a big trend at the moment, and there is a lot of nuance around that. But what I love about the Epicureanism angle is people think it's like being hedonistic, and they would associate it with, oh yeah, let's drink, let's get drunk. But the original philosophy was about that moderation.
Yeah.
And I like the idea of like doing an Epicurean drink event with no and lows, like a drink activation campaign, where it's like, look, this Epicureanism thing is not about hedonism. It's flipping it on its head to say, being an Epicurean is not what you think it is, but we want to encourage moderation with this no and low spirit or wine or whatever they've got. And then to me, that's a really cool idea to play around with, and something that I am going to make happen one day.
And it's such we're seeing it here in the States too, right? No and lows, and the good category that you just created there. I don't know. I haven't heard that one before. But like, we're seeing it here with a lot of, beer brands that are investing in no alcohol beers, wine, spirits. And I'll say, like, when Melissa, my wife, was pregnant, we were buying some non-alcoholic spirits, and holy shit, they were expensive. I mean, they were charging a premium, and I couldn't get past the fact that I was paying double for something that wasn't going to have an effect on me. Although I did geek out looking at the label of the bottle. I remember this one specific. I think it was called Monday Morning or Monday or something like that, and it was a brand. And I think like the label itself was like really Art Deco and beautifully designed, and but like, you see the trend more and more, and so that's really interesting. The idea of like an Epicurean event where you're flipping it around. I love that idea of just kind of flipping things on its head. When we talk about Stoicism, like, a lot of the core tenets around Stoicism is around community and humanity, right? Like doing good for the community. What's good for the hive is good for the bee, kind of deal. So how do you believe brands can contribute to their ideals, and like what their responsibility is in supporting society? Like what is that responsibility that brands have to the community, to society, to humanity?
Oh, what a question that is. But I mean, just to take an example, look at Patagonia, for example. I think that is one of the best case studies that I can think of off the top of my head about an ethical brand that is actually trying to practice what it preaches. And to me, that is something to follow, in the sense of, everything they're doing is not about profit anymore. Look, I don't even know how much money they're making at this point, but there is like a very key narrative of ethics there, and their philosophy is got down to the details of it. And I think they've done a great job of instilling it into their staff. So on that note, I think that's how you'd actually start with the brand. It is, people have got to believe it from the top, but then let it trickle down.
Yeah.
And then it is about finding the causes that actually resonate with the people in the business. It's actually saying, we have made this money and we can give it back to this cause, but again, not do it just to tick a box or to be perceived to be good or perceived to be ethical. It is doing it because internally they know it's the right thing, and not necessarily even having any PR around it, because again, that is a different thing altogether. It is like, you know, PR in itself is to, you know, put a spotlight on these causes, to actually say, oh, we've given this money for this, and that is all well and good, but why not do any PR at all? Just say, yeah, well, we did this. You know, you don't have to make a big song and dance about it. It's just doing the right thing for the right thing's sake. And I think that is something that gets lost sometimes.
It absolutely does. And I worked with a brand once that was trying to force feed a purpose campaign, right? They were searching for it for like the wrong reasons, right? Like there's a campaign, Tide Load of Hope, here in the States. And Tide is like a clothing washing brand. They make detergent for the washing machine. So when there was, you know, maybe 15 years ago, 12 years ago, I forget what it was, there was a big hurricane down in New Orleans, Hurricane Katrina, and it decimated the city. Like, it was horrible. And Tide went down there and washed, you know, in a natural disaster, oftentimes people don't have the opportunity to wash their clothes, you know, especially if water, if it's flooding and there's water. So they created this whole purpose campaign. It became a whole thing called Tide Loads of Hope. They show up when natural disasters happen to help people get clean clothes. And it's fucking brilliant. Like, it's a brilliant campaign that has longevity, that has purpose to it. And it was created for an actual reason. But now you get copycat brands that are like, well, I want our own loads of hope. Well, it just doesn't work like that. Like, you can't shove the circle into the square and expect people to believe that it's actually a circle. The consumers are smarter. They're going to see through that. And so, you know, I think that, like, when brands need to think about that purpose and what they're about, like, you have to give it thought and you have to put a real strategy around it, but it also has to be like, it has to be real. It has to be something that everyone believes in. You said something else, Jamie, that was awesome. Like, everyone top down needs to believe it, like from CEO to janitor. You know what I mean? Like, they all need to be sharing that story. And there's a quote that I've used in the past, and you'll get a kick out of this. Marcus Aurelius says, let us stop talking about being a good man, just be one. For years, I've been pretty public in saying, like, stop talking about what a good brand is and just be one. Like, you don't need to put the spotlight on, look how great we are in this righteousness that you're throwing out there, which is just rooted in vanity. Just do the effing right thing. Like, that's all there is. Do the right thing for your customers.
Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, I'm a quoteaholic myself. Marcus has got so many good lines as well, like Seneca, all of them. Just, again, beautiful thing about Stoicism, so aphoristic and just so easy to apply, but also you just got to do the work, haven't you? And that's just the message.
You brought up Seneca, which is interesting. Seneca is of the core three Stoic philosophers. You got Marcus Aurelius, that maybe everyone knows, and if you don't know, I highly recommend going out and buying a copy of Meditations. And I usually have Marcus on the wall behind me, but he's in my other office. I should have brought him. You have Epictetus, right, who was the slave that found his freedom after so many years. But then you have Seneca, and Seneca was, you know, the modern day, you know, he was in Nero's court. He was a playwright. He was a politician. He was, you know, a philosopher. What do you think? Let's talk personal branding real quick. Let's take a big left turn. Seneca, like, what do you think his personal brand, like, looking back on it now, 2,000 years later, like, what do you think about his personal brand?
Oh, we've not got enough time on this podcast in this episode. But yeah, I'll pare down my thoughts about this. But yeah, Seneca's brand, fascinating. Like, just look at his letters. Like, that is the
to Lucilius, his letters to Lucilius. Yeah,
that is his playbook on his branding. Because if you read it, just the way he uses rhetoric to be able to speak across generations, like you think he's talking to you, but he was actually doing it in a very nuanced way, because he wanted the other Roman elite to be able to read these letters and actually be perceived to be the philosopher that he tried to be in life. And you even look at, I don't know if you've heard the story of pseudo Seneca, but you've got two different versions of him. You see a very gaunt man who originally was thought to be Seneca. There was a bust that was discovered a couple of 100 years ago where people thought this was Seneca, but it actually turns out that it wasn't. But he had that idea of Seneca looking like he wanted to appear, where there's the real Seneca. There's a bust with him back to back with Socrates, and he looks like he's a very well-fed man who ate very well.
Yeah.
And to me, that is the perfect duality of it. It is, he wanted to be perceived to be this like impoverished philosopher who had all these wise ideas, versus, you know, Nero's lackey. Sometimes he folded in these really big moments when he might have been able to do something, but he still tried to apply stoicism in his own way and in his own creative way. So that's where a lot of the complexity for stoicism comes in with Seneca, and he's a great case study. But I actually wrote an article about his tone of voice as well, based on the letters, and trying to break that down was fascinating in terms of picking up his language, how he writes through the letters, and how he actually captivates people. So that was a super fun exercise for me to do.
Oh, that's really interesting. High level, was he full of shit? What do you think?
Yes. Yes, there was a very big part of him that Seneca was full of shit, but paradoxically, he also did not want to be full of shit. He was very self-aware about that, I think.
Yeah.
He still actively tried, which I think is the key. Even with all of his power and his riches, he still was very self-aware enough to try to write and actually do something about it in his own way. So that is why I love having an endless debate about the different complexities of who he was, because I personally think that we are all more than just one thing. Seneca was a politician. He was also a brilliant writer, a brilliant psychologist who understood the human condition thousands of years before anybody knew what they were talking about, and was still quoting him to this day, but also a brilliant marketer as well, because we're talking about him to this day. So yeah, those are my high-level thoughts about that.
If we get nothing else out of this conversation, Seneca was full of shit sometimes. Final question surrounding, you know, stoicism particularly, and branding. You know, we look at, you know, virtue is kind of like that center of stoicism. It's all about the virtuous life. How do you go about guiding brands to reflect virtue in their communication, and how important is it to their success?
Yeah, I think it's massively important. And the way I do that is through a workshop called Brand Circles of Care, which is around their values. So before any copy would be written, if I was working on a certain project, then it is going in and asking people from the top, the CEO, down to the newer staff as well, to say, let's do an exercise around what your values are. Let's start with some buzzwords just to dig into them. Like, how are you trying to apply them? You want to be educational, you want to be sustainable, right? Let's unpick that. But let's look at it across your customers. Let's look at it across how you want to recruit, how you want to choose partners, how you want to put that on your website, and do all of that deep work before anything goes out. And I've found, just based on doing this workshop, sometimes people seem to get that clarity in the moment where they might not have thought this necessarily. And then that means I'm also in a better position to write the copy if that's what's needed. But at the end of the day, they still have that values clarification. And it's interesting you put on virtues, because I like to look at it more as ideals, where virtue might be something like virtue signaling. So it depends on the message you're trying to get. But ideal to me is a lovely word, because to me it implies something to reach for. You might never get there, but you know, there's another thing in Stoicism called the Stoic sage, where they are modeling an example of somebody who was like completely enlightened, just a construct that people can reach for. So if brands have that ideal in mind and they still keep going for it continuously, then step by step they'll make progress. And the goalpost might shift slightly, but if as long as you're still moving towards that ethical standpoint, then I think that is the path to follow.
The journey of 1,000 steps starts with a single step, right? Like there's a great movie that I like to quote. It's from the 80s, and it's called What About Bob? It's got Bill Murray, and he's a psychological mess in it, and he meets with a therapist, and the therapist is basically tells him baby steps. Everything is a baby step. So like it's a funny scene, but how right it is. Like step by step, whether it's conditioning the human in us, or it's the personal brand or the corporate brand, like everything has its process, everything has to be step by step, and you have to, at every chance that you get, reflect inward and make sure that what you're doing is necessary. Make sure what you're doing is on strategy and aligned to your ideals. And so Jamie, I find what you do and how you're able to, layer in philosophy, especially Stoicism, with branding, really cool, really fascinating, and really needed today. Especially, even us as branders, a lot of us are bullshit. You know what I mean? There's a lot of mediocrity happening within the creative environment. And so, I hope that this conversation is out there to help inspire, people to pick up philosophy. And by understanding yourself, you can understand your clients so much better. And we need to all be better. So Jamie, as our Chief Philosophy Officer of the day, tell everyone how they can get in touch with you and where you live on the internet.
I'm going to take that name with me now. Yeah, you can find me at stoicanthenium.com, where I've got my copywriting services and any Stoic or philosophical resources you like. You can also sign up to my newsletter, Sexy Philosophy, which completely has weekly wisdom tips and advice for businesses who just want to live more ethically in their own authentic way.
That's great. Thanks for being a guest on the Branders Magazine Talking with Branders podcast. I, again, am Stephen Bacanza. For more on us, you can check us out at brandersmagazine.com. We're on all the fancy social networks. Please subscribe right below. And for more on me, go to stephenbacanza.com. And until next time, peace out.